When we're talking about climate change, it's not only about environmental degradation. Of course, this is the most obvious thing we see when temperature increases, that, well, we as humans, and you in Jakarta or Depok realize that adapting to higher temperatures there is a certain point of time where this is just becoming very tricky and very difficult. So we see changing environmental patterns. But we also should think about what are the economic losses we see, and for whom are these economic losses important. Think about fishermen that cannot catch as many fish as they did before because the grounds they're catching the fish has been heating up. Or think about farmers who have to struggle with droughts and other environmental changes. And it's also there's also a social dimension to it. So you mentioned EVs, for example. So who do you think can adapt to climate change more easily? And it's most likely richer people who can afford ACs, who can afford shifting to electric vehicles, whereas the poorer population is often more negatively affected by the effect of climate change. So there is a social dimension. There are injustices that appear when we think about climate change. And finally, there's a political dimension. So there are different interests, different power relations ingrained into how we tackle climate change. Think about the role of the coal industry. Think about the role of different industrial lobbyists and their relation to politics. So it's quite a complex problem, but there is obviously a need to tackle it. And internationally, we've seen now more than 50 years of kind of awareness raising and it's kind of well, trying to govern this problem, which is internationally not very easy since we don't have a world government and we need to have the agreement by all member parties. So what we've seen since the 1970s with transboundary air pollution and environmental threats that go beyond national borders, that there has been, well, kind of an international governance arrangement built around these environmental issues, and particularly climate change came into the picture in 1992. So long story short is that we ended up in Paris, as that is often described as a major breakthrough in international politics and international climate governance, while the actual hard part is still to come, that is implementation. So we have an agreement at the international level where basically 198 parties said, well, climate change is a problem. We need to reduce our emissions to bring temperature increase down to 1.5 degrees until the end of the century. But we don't actually know how to do this. And this is where it becomes interesting, and this is where it becomes challenging. How do we achieve the targets basically governments around the world agreed upon, except for Donald Trump, but that's another story. Okay, and how is Indonesia doing? Before coming to Indonesia, globally, the picture is not looking too good. So there is, well, there are many NGOs working on this, but here is an example from the Climate Action Tracker. So an NGO that basically tracks how countries are fulfilling the targets, or if they're, how the world would look like if they achieve what they agreed upon. And it's basically saying, well, you see, highly insufficient, critically insufficient, insufficient. And what this means is that by the end of the century, as you know, so 1.5 degree target, so that's the green one is the Paris Agreement target, so what everyone commits to. And this is seen as a range where we could still deal with changing climate patterns and we could probably still keep on living on this planet. Whereas we are here with 3, 4, or even more than 4 degrees Celsius temperature increase means massive disruptions and a lot of challenges and a hot world that is almost uninhabitable anymore. So how is Indonesia doing? According to Climate Action Tracker, not too well. So highly insufficient. So Indonesia has also agreed or pledged to become carbon neutral by 2060. On the way there, there's still very much unclear how to do this. And according to this data, if Indonesia is following the track it is currently outlining, which mean that we'll reach it at about 4 degrees or 3 to 4 degree temperature increase by the end of the century. So there's room for improvement. Right. And okay, so now come to the question, well, how can we do this? How can we govern climate change? How can we tackle it politically? And how can we develop the institutions needed to address this issue? And there are various options, if I can somehow. Okay. Think about climate change as a crisis. So here's a question. What do you remember? How was Indonesia handling the COVID-19 crisis? What happened with you, your lives? What happened during the pandemic? Was there anything special about this? It's quite a simple question. So maybe it's too simple for you. I apologize. Okay, you did proper regulation. So there was obviously a government acting. And what kind of regulation do you remember? Social distancing, right. So have you had a lockdown? Lockdowns, or like how long was the lockdown? Okay, so it was a very long lockdown, right? Okay. And what would you say, what are the lessons learned from this pandemic in terms of how to govern a crisis? If something like this, another virus, another pandemic comes to Indonesia, what do you think will happen? Okay, so we have disruption for the economy and for the political environment. What I just want to say is that what I think happened in Indonesia and elsewhere in the world, there was quite some drastic reaction. So limiting human, well, your freedom, obviously, of moving around. I see a lot of people wearing masks. So also this is a kind of reaction, so a political reaction, a regulation where governments say, okay, to stop spreading the virus, there are certain measures to be taken. And what you saw actually with the pandemic in different contexts in the world was quite a, well, obviously in the beginning you were unsure, but in the end, quite radical political decisions and government decisions from top down. Now this cartoon, or the cartoonist, tried to compare this with other crises that happened. And so you mentioned economic recession already. How do you deal with this? And then there is the climate crisis. And if you compare it, these two crises, and think about their dimension, at least the one who made this cartoon thought like, well, actually handling COVID crisis was an easy target, right? For governing something that is very direct and very concrete. Although you can't really see the virus, you can measure it. You can measure how it is spreading, and you know how to prevent spreading, or at least reduce the spreading of the virus through social distancing. So there is an immediate reaction of the political system, of the administrative system to deal with this crisis. Whereas with climate change, it's challenging. So it's more invisible than the virus, and it's more. It involves many more different stakeholders around the world to tackle this, and there's also some competition going on. When you think about like who has to do the first step to address climate change. So this is the challenge. It's nothing less than kind of the biggest crisis, at least for the cartoonist, to solve. Okay. And we have a range of options to govern and to steer action to tackle climate change. First one is, or how you can structure it, is that there are a lot of technical questions to be asked. So like who's in charge, who has the regulatory power to implement something. What should good policies look like? So in terms of policy designs, that probably many of you also are investigating in your studies. And how can action at different levels from different sectors be coordinated? So if you think about EV cars or think about public transportation, who is involved and how is the industry involved, how is civil society involved? So this is more of a technical question of looking at the challenge. And you can think about technical issues here. Okay. Is that it is on a range between top-down regulation, as we've seen with the COVID crisis, but also a lot of bottom-up collaborative action, what we call coordinated efforts with different stakeholders. So the one is more steering from top-down and regulating from top-down, and the other one is to think about technological innovations, to give room for new innovations and have the framework for businesses to thrive, for civil society actors to get involved. The other aspect that is important is the politics. So who benefits, who loses? What kind of society do you want to live in if we're governed by climate change? So it's more the broader questions of politics and also about power relations. And that leads us to questions very fundamental, actually. And here's where kind of political scientists are most involved in questions of democratic quality, of deliberation. So how can we tackle a crisis like climate change democratically versus what is here called eco-authoritarianism, like from top down? Yes, of course. Yeah, you can always interrupt. Where is the role of message? Very good question. And actually, I'll come to this in the end, because what I call imaginary governance basically draws on questions of ideology, also on questions of ethical questions, and it's somewhere here. What society do we want to live in? What kind of values do we have? What kind of morals do we want to put forward when tackling climate change? So I'll keep this for a second, or a minute. I'm trying. Okay, so the first one, I just go quickly through these. Regulatory governance, whoops, that was a bit too quick, means, as we've seen very nicely with tackling the COVID crisis, is that you have a strong system of rules and regulations, you abide and you acknowledge to tackle climate change. So you have a very technical approach in a way. You want to reduce emissions or you want to improve climate adaptation. And you basically set up a law for this. And then it's up to you to monitor and evaluate if this is also being followed up. Examples are emission splitting schemes, carbon taxes, particularly from the government. So to put a price on carbon, it's a very simple, effective regulation, but it has, of course, a lot of challenges attached to it. Energy efficiency standards, so make it mandatory for new houses being built to have a certain classification. So this is very clearly regulation and kind of also, I think, for public administration scholars at the heart of what you're dealing with and what we're dealing with in broader political context. And here's an example, the Kyoto Protocol from 1997, where countries agreed upon clear targets, they had a measurement how to achieve it, and also implemented some ways to deal with non-compliance, although it didn't really work out. However, because something like this happened, that over the years, emissions have risen quite dramatically, particularly in China. So the effectiveness of this regime was not really outstanding. Another example is going to the courts. So this is demanding regulatory action, basically. And this is what we see in the US, what we see in Europe, that we have the situation that in 2015, countries said yes to the Paris Agreement and said yes to mitigate climate change, but there's little action and follow-up on this. So people, particularly civil society organizations, go to court to demand more regulation, to demand stricter regulation. And sometimes they are successful, sometimes they are not. But we see an increasing demand for a strong state, basically. So a strong administration that implements the rules that they actually agreed upon in 2015. So this is regulation from top down. First of all, what do you think are the advantages of such an approach? The other side of the story is so-called collaborative governance. And this is basically what the whole Paris Agreement and the new international governance arrangement to tackle climate change is based upon. Because governments realize that strict regulation, top-down regulation, does not work well. So countries try to sneak out, countries are in a global competition. So when they say they want to reduce emissions, it also often means that they lose economic competitiveness. So one way to change this mindset is to think about a more facilitative regime. So something that focuses on collaborative action, on joint action, on public-private partnerships, so more on voluntary action and technological innovation. So,
nous voici donc presque au bout du chemin.
Can you switch off the sound? Yes, perfect. Okay, because they can just talk in the back, and then you can move on. Yeah, so just to see. So here are the last minutes or seconds actually before the Paris Agreement was decided upon in 2015. And what Paris is mainly about is it has a goal, but you don't know how to achieve this goal. So countries are asked to provide and update so-called nationally determined contributions. And every country has some flexibility and some room for improvement over time. So the basic idea or the hope for the Paris Agreement or of the Paris Agreement is that we will improve over time through voluntary action, through pledges by businesses, through civil society active on the ground. And this whole arrangement is completely different to a state saying, okay, you do this and that. It's a state saying, here's some incentives, here's the environment for businesses, for example, to flourish and to develop electric vehicles or whatever. So this is the other part of the story. And if we move forward, yeah, somehow next slide. Oh yeah, Sweden, and yeah, switch off the sound again. Okay, here's Sweden, and Sweden incorporates this kind of collaborative governance model. So they decided also in 2015, recreate a so-called fossil-free Sweden initiative, and it's a multi-stakeholder initiative that is inviting all stakeholders, civil society, municipalities, businesses, industry, to work together and to develop a roadmap to achieve decarbonization by 2045. The basic hope behind this is that through technological advancements, there's going to be carbon neutral steel, carbon neutral concrete, and other innovations to tackle the crisis. So this is kind of a state steering towards decarbonization, but the industry sector is very much in the driving seat when it comes to implementation and thinking about roadmaps to achieve decarbonization. So again, it's not the state saying you have to, but it's rather the industry saying we can do until this and that time. So, and of course, here again, I have the question for you. Next slide. Kind of stuck in this. Yeah, you can move to the next slide. Okay, yeah, what are the advantages and disadvantages of such an approach?
I think the advantages of bottom-up because it has more endurance. When you from top down, it has advantage like from more consistent, more spread out. But every regime that new regime for every 5 years, then I change the regulation, change the policies. But if bottom-up collaborative government is secure, it has more consistency and more sustainability, I think.
Okay, what about the rest? Do you agree or disagree, or do you have any other ideas? Do you have any other ideas? Do you actually see this in Indonesia? I'm curious. Do you have a lot of collaborative efforts in Indonesia? You're the public administration expert, the future public administration experts. So what would you say if someone comes as I from as a foreigner and looks at Indonesia? Is it more a regulatory state or a state that is more building on collaboration, cooperation?
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
Whoever that is, I can see you.
Yeah. Yes. I think regarding the political, political activity now in Indonesia to enter the election for next year election, I see that no one political activist, political actor, or the person who tried to get the job there talk about the climate change, so that for public administration sectors, not easy to develop some kind of strategy or whatever without the political actor over there, take the position regarding this one, because as we know, Indonesian now belong to the country that every policy must be clearance in the political table, and someone just say that the policy, the decision of the policy belong to the chairperson of the political party. So that's not easy for Indonesian to take a kind of program or strategy regarding how to mitigate and adaptation regarding the climate change. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much for this insight into how climate change is obviously not on the priority list for political leadership in Indonesia. And just if we go away from climate change, how is it for other sectors like industrial development? Would you rather say you have a strong state that implements everything top down, or is it more a state that provides a certain environment for businesses, for industry and others to flourish? How would you characterize your own country? If such a political science nerd comes to you and is interested in your country, or a public administration nerd, I think that's also possible.
Can I talk about the bottom-up strategy that you mentioned there? The last 3 years ago, I engaged in research about the climate change and how the person at the bottom, like the peasant or person in deal with the climate or many things that change. Yeah, they know they face about the climate change effect in their activity. However, and also they have a kind of what I mean that the belief that something wrong already happened now, but the academics cannot capture how they translate the way to adapt or to mitigate the climate change, and it's the problem with the communication or how to discuss with the bottom people underneath that. They know that a kind of problem now still going on. they know that weather, extreme weather, they think it's that happen by the human action, anthropogenic one. Not the that's not the talk about the anthropogenic, but they talk about that many people, industrial or whatever, the city person in say the city, inhabitant of the city, make a bad behavior regarding the climate, so that they think they are the victim, a little bit like that. But my research is still going on, so I cannot define or conclude about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I would like to see your results and your research results. Okay, then maybe